Well, I'm very honored to be in conversation with you, sir. The last time we were together was in 2010. So this is actually, everyone's asked me since I've arrived when the first time I came to Poland was, and it was actually in November of 1999, the year Poland was invited to join NATO, and it was then First Lady Hillary Clinton's third trip to Poland at the time. And I was Deputy Chief of Staff at the State Department when you were in round one of being Minister of Foreign Affairs. And back then, the conversation that our two countries were having was related to discussing clean energy infrastructure and technology. We were having conversations about strengthening civil society and transparency. So I'm curious, all these years later, number one, how is round two of being Minister of Foreign Affairs going? And secondly, what do you see, what are your priorities when it comes to the U.S.-Polish bilateral relations? There's obviously lots happening in the region we'll talk about, but I wanted to start there.
But if memory serves, Hillary also came to Krakow for the Community of Democracies. And also we signed an annex to the Missile Defense Agreement.
Yes.
So we were very much aware even then of the threat of ballistic missiles.
That's right.
From Iran and other directions. So the security relationship is the core of our relationship. We see you as our main ally, not only in the nuclear field, but beyond that. In my first round, I was asking for 10,000 US troops in Poland, and presto, we have 10,000 US troops in Poland. And I would rather avoid the circumstances, but here we are.
Right.
Poland was, and I hope still is, an icon of success in overcoming communism and a command economy and dictatorship. And in that sense, we are made for each other because you have the global reach, but we have a good story to tell of how you progress from democracy to freedom, from dictatorship to freedom. But in addition, in between, we've had, didn't work out, although we have the energy relationship. Originally, it was supposed to be the gas that you get from, what do you call it, shale gas.
Yes, shale gas, yeah.
At a certain moment, we had the largest number of drillings in Europe, and now it's going to be nuclear.
Yeah, that's right. You are correct about all that additional bilateral relationship. I see that your memory is as good as hers when it comes to every single effort that you made on behalf of your countries. And you're right. In fact, I remember I was telling people at the dinner last night, for those of you who were at the dinner, that when Hillary came as First Lady, one of the first meetings that she had in her trip in 1994, I believe, was with Miłosz, considered, a dissident in the olden times, and having a real life experience of what it was like to talk to somebody who advocated for democracy and where you are now. I want to shift to your commitment to, Poland now spends 4% of its GDP on military spending, and you doubled that number from previous years.
It's actually more than the United States.
It's and you're one of the highest percentage of any NATO country, if I understand correctly.
The highest.
The highest. Okay, the highest. But I'm curious, how do you think about balancing this level of spending with other social and economic interests is related to your country?
Well, we have a saying in Poland: every country has an army, either your own or a foreign one. We have experienced many times that your own, in the long run, is cheaper.
Yeah. Very well said. Very well said, sir.
We will do whatever it takes not to be a Russian colony again.
Yeah. Well, You know, you've shared your personal story a fair amount in the past, and talk about how you grew up in a Soviet colony, and I can relate in that even though I'm an American, I didn't live in the United States until university. I grew up in an absolute monarchy, and my father always would tell me and my siblings that to live in a democracy was a privilege, but that also no freedom was absolute. There are consequences to every decision we make as individuals, and certainly that our leaders make. So when you hear things like the Russian president saying that Russia has no borders, and the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, these are scary things to hear, and you have made the case. You were in the United States. I was listening to the speeches that you made both at the UN Security Council, which for those of you who haven't watched it, I'm sure everyone in this audience has, but really correcting the record about the truth of history. We just did a panel about the importance of history.
There are some pleasures in this job.
And that was, and that was a tremendous one. And also making the case for why it was important, how to, bring security back into the world with this threat. The United States has committed this historic $175 billion towards the effort in Ukraine. You've obviously been a great advocate for the support, both military, financial, economic. But could you explain for those audience members who are not, who are sitting across the Atlantic, why America's future is so closely linked with what is happening here? We're entering an election season, we're in the midst of an election season in our country, and trying to explain why this is so connected to them is something we often, as those of us who are in public service, feel like we have to remind Americans. So could you, from your perspective?
Well, at the crudest level, 90% of the money will be spent in the United States on weapons that will be delivered to Ukraine. In addition, Poland alone has ordered $55 billion worth of armaments from the United States. From the beginning of the war, Europe has ordered tens of billions of dollars worth of American equipment. But that's just the base. The more important arguments are more general. We need a victory. We've been, as the West, we've been demoralized. I think the Clintons was the height of the liberal consensus and of the reach of democratic government around the world. Yeah. We've had quite a few defeats since then. We made bets that have not paid for us. We hoped that the Arab Spring would be what 1989 was for Central Europe. Didn't work out. We hoped that China, included in WTO, would become a responsible stakeholder. Not quite. You bet, rather, that if we embrace Russia, she will also democratize. They've gone at a tangent, and so on. Ukraine wants to be like Poland. They want to become a normal Western democratic free economy country. And after Afghanistan, after Iraq, we need to restore our morale, but also we need to demonstrate to ourselves and to the world that we can win, that actually our system is not just fairer, freer, that is also more efficient and more successful. And all we need to do in this case is to help our friends and allies to do what they want to do anyway.
Yeah.
And also we need to demonstrate to would-be conquerors that recovering what you regard as a renegade province is harder than you think. And you may pay a price that you don't want to pay. And towards whom that kind of demonstration effect is needed. The United States draws benefit from being the leading nation of the West. Your credibility is now tied to this war. Your president went to Kiev in wartime, planted the standard of the United States in downtown Kiev and said, we will do whatever it takes. If you don't come through, there will be consequences too. Some of your allies will then start hedging, and that will have consequences.
Well, sir, I remember very clearly to the point you were just making about walking into the White House, in the Clinton White House in 1996, and certainly feeling as though we were the lone, at the time, superpower in the world. Landing, it felt like so much hope and possibility and progress. There was an active Middle East peace process in the works back then. You had Hillary traveling around the world advocating for women's rights as human rights, and then fast forward being in the United States Senate in the early 2000s. And I remember the first trip, and I know you've spent time in Afghanistan as well, but that first Senate congressional delegation to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then going subsequently back year after year, 2003, 2005, and then finally, and I don't forget, and maybe because I come from both worlds, I grew up in the Middle East, I have a South Asian background, is to sit in these rooms with particularly women in Kabul and in Baghdad, and them reaching out and saying, when will this end? And the lack of understanding in some cases that people didn't have, and frankly even American leaders didn't have, for the disparate groups, how complicated, these weren't just these countries with just masses of people. They were very complicated religious, social, and cultural dynamics. So I certainly relate very much to what you're saying about seeing that transition and how our power, if you will, has been experienced in the last 25 years. But I'm also curious about how, we woke up this morning to news that even U.S. government officials, I'm just reading what I know in the news, I don't get classified information anymore, but that there is concern about the momentum shifting in the war in Ukraine towards Russia, that even though the money, the U.S. bill was finally passed 3 weeks ago, that will take a while for there to be progress seen on the ground in Ukraine. How are you feeling? There's been conversation about troops on the ground, NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. How are you feeling today about what the next few months looks like in Ukraine?
I'll get to that, but recalling that time, you had your unilateral moment.
Yeah.
You spent your political capital on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were not exactly a success. I actually feel guilty towards that generation of Afghan women to whom we gave the promise of a better life, and that promise has been disappointed. They've been beaten back by the Taliban, and it's horrible.
Yeah.
So you need to now husband your resources much better and pick your fights. But this is one we can win. We've given Ukraine so far, Europe and the US together, about $250 billion, euros, roughly. We, the European Union, we are a 14 trillion euro economy. You are around the same in dollars. Russia is a 1.8 trillion economy. We are 20 to 22 times bigger. If we re-industrialize in the defense sphere, we can outproduce the Russians, and then the Ukrainians can win. But it has to be done, and it's been done far too slowly. And President Putin invaded Ukraine on completely false assumptions, which is why he hasn't succeeded yet. But we now have to take his threats seriously. He's now threatening NATO countries. It would be really irresponsible not to take him at his word. Therefore, we need to deter him. We need to devote some serious resources to winning this war.
Well, and especially when the word nuclear gets thrown around as a threat to the rest of us. You're 100% right about Afghan women. I feel that very personally. For some of us were involved in non-governmental organizations trying to help with the evacuation process. And to your point, you had women calling us and saying, "Are you really going to leave us here to die?" It was a very difficult. It was and continues to be a very difficult time for Afghan women. I want to shift to elections, if that's okay. I cannot believe we're running out of time already. I have so many questions for you, but half the world is voting this year. You had elections early on. You have elections coming up in June. We have an election coming up in November. One of the things that those of us who were involved in the 2016 presidential election in the United States really experienced, and I think we would argue we were actually the appetizer, the warning, the siren, call for what happens when there is active Russian disinformation, misinformation, outright fake news put out in the world. In our case, it was through Facebook and Twitter, and all kinds of facts were put out in the world that as we were experiencing this, you're talking to somebody who was in the midst of this campaign and hearing things that just were so beyond the possibility of truth that you almost dismissed them, and the truth being you can't do that, actually. I grew up in the, in the 90s of, the 24-hour CNN news cycle where you only lifted up the stories, your proactive message, and you kind of ignored the nonsense. And the truth is we live in a time when you just can't. It all comes in. That we now know that interference really did affect our general election. Hillary lost, for those people who weren't living under a rock. But there were European countries who had elections the following year who actually benefited from that warning call because they could prepare, whether it was in the Netherlands and then in France and Germany, the presidential elections, the general elections, where there was plenty of time to, I want you to correct me then, but at least in France, it seems as though it was not successful. Do you worry about that in upcoming elections that you're involved in? And what is the path forward? Can we have free and fair elections in a democratic process today?
The trial run for Russian interference in democratic elections was not in the United States, it was here. In 2014, I received emails from the same Russian organization called Fancy Bears. I just didn't press the attachment. But what happened here was that there was a fake scandal to do with eavesdropped conversations, in which it then turned out the only crime was actually doing the eavesdropping. What the Russians learned from that was that to destabilize a politician, you don't need to prove any wrongdoing at all. All you need to do is to show the contrast between how politicians communicate in public and how they communicate in the privacy of internal emails. And this is what they used against Hillary. There was nothing in the emails, was there?
There was not.
But there was a difference
aside from pizza and socks.
Right, but there was a difference of tone. And in 2014, I wrote about it in the US media. My wife wrote about it in the Washington Post, that this is coming to the United States. And you thought they wouldn't dare do it to you. And then they did, and they succeeded, unfortunately.
They did succeed, but we also, in real time, even in the midst of a campaign and alerting some of these social media platforms, the response we got back then was a little bit of disbelief, a little bit of let's look into it. It was all happening so fast, but I would argue the course of history was changed rather dramatically because of that. So.
Sure. And we are now doing more to counter these threats.
Yeah.
But we should also not be slaves to the business models of some of these social media platforms. You know, these algorithms, and I know that they make money from this, but they are actually bad for us, they are bad for our democracy, and they are bad for our children.
Yeah.
You know what we could do? We could ban the algorithms. There is nothing sacred about using algorithms to keep people's attention and to interfere with their minds. You know, in the 1970s, people discovered that if you flash very brief ads on the telly, it affects people's subconscious. And what did your FCC and European equivalents do? We banned that practice. If something is bad for society, we can ban it.
Well, Mr. Minister, thank you for your time. That is a solution that we should all be following. Thank you.